Hi there, it's Gabrielle Nicolay from SpeechKids and Raising Orchid Kids, where we teach little kids to talk and help parents understand their kids. And today I'm so excited to have Kelly Dorfman with me. Kelly, thank you for doing this.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Gabrielle.
Kelly is I'm going to read it because I will get it wrong, licensed nutritionist and dietitian. Licensed in the state of Maryland and in the District of Columbia, but sees families around the country and around the world. And Kelly, tell the good people sort of why you're doing what you're doing. What are you doing? Like, why do people call you?
That's such an esoteric question.
No, sorry.
Why am I here? What are we doing here? What is our purpose? I have a practice that really started out and still continues to this day to be the place that people come when they've gone other places and they haven't gotten the answers they want. And so I always have specialized in complex medical problems. And many, many years ago, that became the new kids on the spectrum, because most people don't remember when the spectrum was an odd thing, 1 in 4,000 kids. Now it's 1 in 60 boys and like 1 in 100 kids. And so it's really changed the way we look at it. And many of us arguably say there's more kids on the spectrum with these kind of issues. But at that point, when they were first coming to me, we didn't know what to do with them, and we had to figure that out. And as a result, I ended up with a lot of kids in my practice. And an old psychiatrist who has now passed away, very world famous, his name was Stanley Greenspan, and he just sent me everybody in his practice because he thought that I knew what to do with them. So he just kept sending me people. And so I had to figure out what to do with them. And I've worked with doctors all over the place. I know Marilyn Agan, who was a late talker in New York, and we have done some work together. And yes, so this has become something that I became interested in. I started a nonprofit with 3 other people that was now taken in by another nonprofit called Epidemic Solutions, but at the time, or Epidemic Answers rather, it was called Developmental Delay Resources. And we were looking for non-toxic ways to address these emerging developmental issues that seem to be going crazy and expanding. And there were so many kids. And so that's how I got interested in it. And then I ended up writing a book, Cure Your Child with Food, about the way you can use nutrition therapeutically. And that's what I'm really interested in. I want to help people think about how to use nutrition. Could it be nutrition? That would be the question. Could it be chemical? Could it be something I could have providence over, something I could do something about?
Yeah, and that moment, before we hit record, I said, let's talk about the late talkers, because, and the reason is I have a selfish interest because number one, I love that age. Number two, I see a lot of late talkers. And, anecdotally, I can tell you, I'm seeing more late talking. I don't have a study that says that there are more kids who are later to talk in the world, although maybe there are. Probably there are. But walk us through, like, why should we think about food or nutrition as being related to brain health? Like, why?
That's a great question. That's the question I wish everybody was asking. And the answer is because there's a chemistry to everything. So you lift your arm, there's a chemistry to that. You think a thought, there's a chemistry to that. You're talking to somebody, there's a chemistry to that. So there's a chemistry to speaking. And if you don't support that properly, then you can have the best therapy in the world. And that's has become a really big part of what I do, is talk to speech therapists and occupational therapists and other therapists who are working their hardest in the trenches to help. And they're running into these barriers. And the problem is very often the kids are picky eaters, or they're very restrictive, or if they have oral motor issues, because that's part of their speaking issue. They don't masticate and chew and swallow food easily. And so they're not the government. They can't run on a deficit. So if the body's budget cutting something, sometimes that's speech, because that's not part of survival really for your body. Fighting that virus, not dying of this infection or that thing, that's important. So if you have limited resources, they're going to go there. And speaking Japanese or even speaking a first language, if you're in the United States, that's what happens.
Yeah. And so we're dealing with these systems. And so this is very typical of a child who comes to my practice. They appear to be typically developing. They but they also have in their history, if you dig deep enough, you get sort of a history of like a sleeping problem, or a history of eczema, or a history of food sensitivity. And there's like this constellation of other stuff. But the reason they're coming to me is because they're not speaking. Right. So first of all, the reason they're not speaking, it has its origins somewhere else, probably. And then the question becomes like, so what is going on? How are all those other things related? Like, how does this all fit together? I know that's a puzzle, and I have a piece and you have a piece, but like, how does this go?
Right. Well, there's many reasons for late talking, of course, and so there's not just one quick answer to that.
Yeah.
But what happens is basically you have these developmental milestones, right? And there are certain times when it's easier to develop certain things. So it doesn't mean if you're a late talker, you'll never talk, but it's trickier to learn to talk if you're out of sort of sync with where your developmental milestones. Like there's these windows. So for example, there's a window for second languages, which is really like around 6. But we don't introduce second languages till 6th grade.
Yeah,
really, in this country. So it's no wonder that Americans are kind of bad at second languages, because we have missed that window. You certainly can learn Spanish or French or German at another time, but it's just not as easy, and you tend to have heavier accents and all that. So we have these windows. So there are windows for development of speech, which of course you're aware of, and that naturally goes forward for some people. For other people, there can be, as you pointed out, obstacles for that. And there are a lot of biological obstacles to that. Sicknesses, ear infections come to mind. There's been a lot of research about frequent ear infections interfering with speech, for example. And kids now have more ear infections than they used to. 50 years ago, a couple of ear infections was a lot. Now it's not unusual to have kids getting, I had to change. I used to say, do you have a lot of ear infections? I don't say that anymore. I say, about how many?
How many?
Because people think a lot of ear infections now is 10 or 12. And in the old days, it would be like, 2 or 3. I mean, who knows what a lot of ear infections was, but it used to be ear infections weren't that common. You'd have one, maybe a kid would have one or 1 or 2, but now it's very common they have chronic. And between those ear infections, there can also be fluid in the ears, and so that's a biological obstacle to that. So you have things that get in the way, like illnesses and obstacles like that. And then there are foods that can create those illnesses. For example, we know from a study that was done here in DC a long time ago, over 20 years ago, that they looked at kids with a lot of ear infections, and they found that if they removed 4 foods, 89% of them stopped having ear infections.
And those 4 foods were?
Dairy, soy, which is a cross reactor with dairy, wheat, gluten foods, and eggs. Yeah. But most of it, to be honest with you, with dairy.
Okay, right about this time, people are getting ready to turn off their computers because they were like, oh my God, I have to give up dairy. Okay, so that's not what we're saying.
No, we're just talking about one small aspect that applies to some people.
Yeah, and so, but this is where it gets tricky, because when we are talking about a food like milk, for example, which is like, we're used to thinking that milk is fundamental to human life, to the human diet, right? And, we all came up on milk and we turned out just fine. I mean, there's a lot of this mindset that goes around. And, when kids are having trouble learning to speak, or they are, having these, they're kind of like subclinical responses, right? To dairy, for example. It's like it builds up, it builds up, it builds up. And then at some point it runs over, and it may or may not run over in different ways. But there's like a tolerance there.
Well, yeah, but I wanted to call it, it's a non-allergic reaction in most cases. Right. So, allergic reactions are now narrowly defined as histamine reactions. So if you don't have a hive, or your throat doesn't close, or you don't have a big rash, or you're full of eczema, then it's not considered allergies. So if you're looking at a child and saying, well, my child's not full of eczema and spots, and they're not, the throat's not closing, so they can't have a dairy problem.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, before age 1, the other symptom is blood in the stool. So those are very classic symptoms. But most kids that are reacting, their immune system's reacting, are having non-allergic reactions.
And
So-
what is a non-allergic reaction? How do we know that that's happening?
That's the tricky question, of course, and that's the $100,000 question. How do you know? Because it's easy to know if you eat a shrimp and your throat closes up. I think I have a problem with the shrimp, right? But if you drink dairy and then the child has reflux the next day, or just isn't sleeping very well, or is congested, I mean, that could be from so many things, right? And those are non-histamine reactions. Histamine reactions almost always involve swelling and itching.
Mm-hmm. Right. And
So
if we
you
don't
talk
have
about
that-
these, yeah. So you talk about non-allergic or sensitivity reactions, and they think that dairy, about 70% of the time, the reactions are like that. However, there's a big however. I was just shocked to see this, Gabrielle, but I found out that the number one kind of hospitalization problem for allergies is no longer peanuts. I thought it was peanuts.
Mhm.
It's dairy. Dairy has gone way, I mean, I read this on the American dermatology, or was it allergy, one of those websites with the associations,
Mhm.
that dairy was the number one cause of these kind of
Wow.
hospitalizations reactions. So we still have plenty of classic reactions,
Mhm.
but your doctor will easily help you find those.
Right.
It's the problem is, are you having a non-allergic, as you're calling it, a subclinical, which is another great way to call this kind of reaction.
Mhm. Yeah. And so, okay, so let's say we have this child, they're not talking, they have maybe some other things happening. And so they've got this immune response, this response to a food in their diet, and a family comes to you. Obviously, you're not going to walk us through specifics, but like, what are the questions that you're asking? What are you looking for? And how does that work? Like, how do you make that better?
Right. I'm glad you asked that, because it's a really fundamental question, is what are you looking for, really? Well, first of all, if you're looking for irritants or something that's in the way, and that's just half of what you're looking for. The other half is what's missing that could help with development. So right now we're kind of in the gnarly web of what could be bothering you. Well, of course, if you have a child that's 1, it's not pork loin or Brussels sprouts, it's something they're eating a lot of. If it's bothering them enough that it's interfering with speech, it's something they're having a lot of. And of course, dairy is going to be that food for the most part, whether they're still nursing and the mother is drinking milk that's coming through human milk, because cow's milk and human milk are different. They both have the protein casein, but there's a lot more casein in cow's milk, like twice as much. And it's a different type of casein. And so casein as a protein is hard to break down. And some people don't do that very well. So while it's true that mother's milk and human milk is fundamental nutrition for toddlers and babies, that is not quite so true worldwide for cow's milk. But it's similar. And so we kind of run them together. And of course, it grows people big. It's full of protein and it's full of calcium for bones. And so there's a lot of good things about it. But because of this complex casein protein, it is a complex protein, it's hard to break down. So you're looking for symptoms that the child is irritated. Is the child an unhappy child? Are they grumpy a lot? Are they up and down a lot?
Okay, stop. Because so many people think that just some kids are grumpy and some kids are fretful. And while there are degrees of that, if we've got communication and eczema and stool problems and sleep problems and we're grumpy, okay, first of all, we're going to be grumpy if we have stool problems because we're uncomfortable all the damn
They all go
time.
together.
Right? They all go together. But it doesn't have to be that way. It's not, right? Fretfulness and stubbornness and unhappiness are not personality traits. They're coping strategies.
I said, excellent point. Excellent point. And there's symptoms too. I mean,
Yes.
So we have this kind of idea. Oh, I just got a grumpy, crazy baby. And that, maybe there's some truth to that. But in my experience, most of the time there's a darn good reason that baby's unhappy.
Yeah.
And, they're not doing a whole lot. They're kicking around, they're sleeping, they're eating. And so you're looking at the food. So you're looking for congestion, a history of reflux, a history of colic, rashes, cradle cap that lasted a long, long time. Constipation in babies is really unusual until about age 1 when they get a lot more whole food. But you shouldn't have a constipated baby at 6 months or 7 months. And I've seen them. They cry a lot after they eat. They're choking on their formula or their food. So there's a lot of symptoms that you can see like that.
And then you mentioned so you're looking at what's present in the diet, and you mentioned you also look for what's missing.
Right, what's missing. So if you think, again, if you're looking at it more like a late talker who's 3 or 4, then they have a more complicated diet.
Yeah.
And so you would look for other things like, were they talking and then they stopped? I mean, that happens a lot at 2. They seem to be beginning to talk. They're saying some words and all of a sudden they kind of back off. So that's one thing that makes you wonder, did something get added? Was there an illness? What happened then? So you're looking at all these patterns, and it sounds complicated, but I would bet you most people listening to this know. Because I'm not a genius. I just ask people, I tell parents, you live with them, what do you think? And they tell me. I mean, they just tell me that I always wondered about blah, blah, but I mentioned it to my brother-in-law or my doctor or whatever, and they said, nah. So I thought I was probably wrong. But parents are often dead on. They don't know why they're dead on. They just have a feeling, this didn't seem right. Or I had another child and they were so different. This was different, so.
Yeah.
But then if you jump over to what could be missing, so you want to remove obstacles to growth and development. And then you want to make sure there's enough basic nutrition and things you need for growth and development. And there are many things that are in this category, but the one that's the most significant with language is long chain fatty acids, which is something that is a fancy word for the kind of stuff you find in fish oil. EPA, DHA, there's a lot of research about language involvement and using these kind of long chain fats.
Why are we still arguing about that?
Oh, we argue about everything in science. No, that's not unusual. I mean, I'm waiting sometimes to see a study that says, and now we know. I mean, they just don't. It's always like we need more studying, and there's always a flaw. There's always something you didn't expect that somebody can find. So that's just part of the way science operates.
The way that I feel as though I have to say this to families is go do your research, talk to your doctor, but nobody ever died, hopefully, knock wood, from a little fish oil.
Unless you're allergic to fish. So assuming they're allergic to fish. Yeah.
So long chain fatty acids. And if you are allergic to fish, I've been seeing like algae, I've been seeing flax. Can you talk about a little bit about like if we're gonna mess with fish oil,
Yeah, so long chain fatty acids, specifically we're talking about the long chain fatty acids that are very predominant in fish, which are called EPA, which is eicosapentaenoic acid, and DHA, which is docosahexaenoic acid. So these are 20 and 22 carbon lengths, so they're really, really long. They're not essential fats, okay? You make them from essential fats and your brain prefers them. So they're structural nutrients for your brain. So I look at this as like giving your brain the brick to build rather than the sand to make the bricks. So if you're eating walnuts, which have essential fats, you're giving your brain the sand to make the bricks that will become structural components of the brain. And the brain is 60 to 70% fat. So the kind of fats are critically important. And this is why all the new prenatals over the last decade have had DHA in them. Because they found when mothers took that when they were pregnant, they had better outcomes when the kids were 4. Yeah.
So that's prenatal vitamins to age 4.
Yep.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah. So especially with visual spatial learning and some other things. And so, yes. So you have to convert the fats that are found in walnuts, the essential fats, to these longer chain fats, or else you eat seaweed or fish and get them directly. But a lot of people don't do that. And so they rely on getting them from the essential fats and then building them from there. But it turns out we're not very efficient at that. And it looks like kids on the spectrum And kids with ADHD and kids that have learning differences and speech involvement issues are particularly bad at this. So it's good to give them the brick already made rather than giving them the sand and hoping they build the brick.
Well, so this is interesting. So this actually plays really interestingly into the whole neurodiversity concept, right? This is, some brains do this process just fine. So one brain eats walnuts, builds the brick builds the wall in the brain, the wall being the brain function, optimal brain function. Another brain takes the sand and is like, what the hell do I do with this? And leaves it in a pile and tries to make a wall out of a pile of sand. And that's just kind of differently prepared, differently wired brains, to coin Debbie Reber's term. And that just kind of is, yeah.
It's a wonderful description. And while some of that's just biological individuality, some of it's also further nutrition, because you need a bunch of nutrients to convert through a process called, I think it's called beta oxidation. Yeah. So you're building these long chain fatty acids, and you need nutrients, you need minerals, you need vitamins. And so if they're short in supply, then you get stuck because you're making a brick, but you don't have the mold, you don't have the other material you need. And that's what you're having. And the brick actually becomes part of the cell walls. I mean, all the cell membranes of almost every cell in your body has this bilipid layer. So it's full of the right kind of fats. And they know in animal studies where they, cut off the head and look inside the brain. And we don't need to talk about that part. They know that after 3 to 4 months of taking fish oils, that the structure of the brain is completely different. It's visibly different under the microscope.
I mean, listen, I am seeing this work with a couple of my clients right now, and it's wild. I mean, to your point earlier about like, we can do great intervention, and we do great intervention, but I can get way more bang for my buck if it's a little bit like, let's just beat the dead horse of the road analogy and the bricks, but like, if my client has a wagon wheel rut through the pasture,
right,
the DHA is going to help build the highway that I am also building, right? So I'm getting better materials to build this highway. And really that's what we want, right? Is functional connectivity in the brain for the functions that the brain needs to engage in. And if we're going to have connectivity, we need fat.
We know that the right kind of fat literally changes the way you send that signal.
Yeah.
So it's like having the right kind of wire that just sends a signal and makes different connections. So we're trying to build a structure so that therapy has a place to hold on to, because we know that in order for learning to happen in the brain structure has to shift to accommodate that learning. So a brain that's learned something looks different. The myelin has gotten thicker. There's more neural connections that are made. There's all this stuff that has to happen. And if that stuff doesn't happen, you keep on having the experience, but you don't learn.
Right. And this is why, this is part of why parents say all the time too, we could do it yesterday. How come we can't do it today? Right. And that's like memory storage, retrieval, all of those things are not happening if and then that literally is one in one ear and out the other, right?
Literally. It's true. But it's so frustrating. You can imagine how frustrated the kids are too. They knew how to ask for what they wanted yesterday, and now they're pointing and screaming again, so it's frustrating for everybody.
Right. When families come to you, I don't know if you're going to be able to answer this question. Is there a period of time that it takes to figure out what's happening nutritionally with a child, or is there a range? Like, how does that work?
Yeah, that is a complicated question because it's so individualized. Sometimes, of course, sadly, you can never figure it out because this is soft science in a way, because you know what you're looking for, but it's not like we have a blood test. Let's do a blood test and see what's going on. I mean, we can do some nutrient tests sometimes, but there's such gross tests. They're looking for such profound deficiencies that they're not really looking for somebody who might have a higher individual need. or may be converting improperly or not binding properly. So it's looking for very gross measures that are measured against 100 people walking down the street on average. So it's not, somebody asked me the other day, my child has ADHD, what blood test should I do? I thought, oh, well, I wish we had a blood test for ADHD. I mean, we definitely have some secondary tests that might be interesting, but we just, with these neurological things, it's not that kind of straightforward. So there's a lot of trial and error, and you have to have some patience for that.
Because it sounds like, you're sort of depending on the same things that I am, which is a behavioral response that indicates a neurological phenomenon.
Yes.
Yeah. And I say this to parents all the time. We don't put kids in scanners yet.
Oh yeah. We tried, but you just can't find the place in the brain, because the brain's a network. And so it's like, oh, there's the language place right over there, beneath Georgia, is where we have a language place. So it's not that simple, really. And you'll find this interesting. So I had talked to a parent this morning, and her child, she has a little girl who's 3.5, who's on the spectrum. And so we were talking, and we got stuck on this constipation thing, because her child had gone on a trip, their family got on this trip, and she came back and she started withholding, which is a very common issue with autism. And so we spent the whole consult talking about why she got nothing done that we talked about because of this terrible constipation problem. And at the very end, she goes, oh yeah, she's talking a lot more. It's like, so she was stuck in saying that she's a complete failure. She had done nothing. I said she'd actually done some of the things, given the child fish oil, for example. But in the meantime, she got stuck somewhere else, which these are kids. This is what happens. Sometimes they get sick with the virus you don't expect, or grandma comes and visits and throws off the schedule or whatever. And so, the last throwaway was, oh yeah, she's talking great. She's talking so much more. So there you go.
If there was one thing that, families who are concerned about speech and language in their children could do just for themselves, what would it be?
You mean beyond finding a good therapist to work with them on the ground? Because I think that you have to start with having a therapist help you. But this is not like we just do nutrition, and just like you're saying, we don't just do therapy.
Thank you for bringing that up, because actually I was going to say that just because we're setting up, you explained it so beautifully, right? We're going to set the brain up for learning, but that's not the learning. We have to do the learning too. And sometimes when it's gone a little bit longer, we have to retrain the brain how to learn. So in the case of chronic ear infections, for example, just because we clear up the fluid and now child can hear, doesn't mean that child is going to speak clearly automatically, or that child knows what to listen for, right? There's a difference between hearing and listening, or knowing how to interpret what you're hearing. And so we have to train that. Yes. So other than finding a really excellent therapist.
Well said. That's well said. Yeah. You have to have really both. And for some kids, quite frankly, it's 80% nutrition and 20% therapy. And for others, it's 80% therapy and 20% or 10% nutrition. So that is very individualized. So it's hard to make a general statement about it, except that they're both involved, but to different extents. I would encourage you, if you have a good therapist and you're stuck and you keep on repeating the same things, that you look at the biological aspects of this. And there is some information on my website, kellydorfman.com, there's some articles about dyspraxia. That's another word or apraxia that's used to describe some of these issues. And there's a whole chapter in my book. My book is called Cure Your Child with Food, and the chapter is called The Child Who Couldn't Speak in Sentences. And it's about the chemistry of language. And I try to put in there the things that work the best for the most kids in terms of getting language going. So we talked about launching fatty acids, but there's also another really interesting nutrient called choline, which is my absolute favorite, which is very responsible for neurocomplexity and motor planning of speech. And very often I have kids start on that, and they go from single words to sentences, again, the same great therapy, going right along, and all of a sudden it just starts to click.
Yeah. Ooh, fantastic. So pick up a copy of the book. check it out at kellydorfman.com, right?
Yes, DORF like fire, MAN.
Fantastic. We're going to put a pin in it here, although you and I could talk for 2 more hours, I'm sure. And
Yes,
thank
it's
you so
fun.
much.
My pleasure, Gabrielle, anytime.
Take care.